very briefly, and this is without talking about ETs at all. I mean, here you have one country, the U.S., on its own, just deciding to send a 2-ton kinetic weapon into the moon in violation of international law, and there's no uproar. Now, if we look at the various treaties, the Outer Space Treaty is a treaty that's been signed by 125 nations and ratified by 96 nations, including the U.S., and it provides that none of the signatories can do anything against international law, and that all of the any act, it prohibits any act of war and mandates that all acts with regard to the moon and other celestial bodies be peaceful. But even more than that, if we go to the Moon Treaty, which has been signed by major space powers like India and France, Article 7 there of the Moon Treaty prohibits and carrying out acts that would create a deleterious environmental impact and on the moon, and requires that all of these be done in consultation with the Secretary General of the UN. Well, clearly that's been violated here.
Yes.
And also the treaty against modification of the environment, which is signed in 1977, what the U.S. has both ratified and signed that treaty, that prohibits the use of any weapon which will modify the environment. And in the definition of what the environment is, it includes outer space.
Yeah.
In the definition areas. So the last time, I mean, we have now 2 wars underway, the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, both of which were undertaken by the U.S. in contravention of international law.
Yeah.
There was no evidence that 9/11 was caused by people in Afghanistan. To the contrary, the evidence shows that the false flag operation of 9/11 was carried out by the highest levels of the government then.
That's right.
Of the U.S.,
yeah.
including President George W. Bush, Vice President Richard B. Cheney, and then Secretary of Defense Donald H. Rumsfeld,
Yes.
and numerous John and Jane Does in the military intelligence establishment of the U.S. who use exotic weapons to bring down the Twin Towers and who carried out a very large PSYOPs, psychological warfare operation, which is what 9/11 was.
Yes.
So the war in Afghanistan is illegal and is causing tremendous losses of civilian lives, which are not being reported in the media, and which has poisoned large sectors of Iraq with depleted uranium from the illegal use of depleted uranium weapons.
Yes.
And this was found by the Tokyo International Tribunal for War Crimes in Afghanistan, which found the illegal use of depleted uranium there by the U.S. and by the UK troops. And the same thing for Iraq. That war was started in 2003 in contravention of the UN Charter, which prohibits wars of aggression. It was started under false pretenses. It's resulted in the deaths of more than 1 million civilians, the displacement of 4 million civilians, and the poisoning of large areas of Iraq with depleted uranium weapons, which are yielding enormous changes to the genome and to the DNA of the people of Iraq and of Afghanistan. The number of birth defects has gone up tremendously.
Yeah.
And some researchers think that this is a policy of depopulation.
Yes.
So those are the last two wars that the U.S. has started without, in violation of treaties that it has signed, such as the UN Charter, which is an international treaty. Now, back to the question of the moon. So here, without getting to any questions about extraterrestrial civilizations on the moon or inside the moon, the U.S. has committed per se violations of treaties that it has signed and of treaties that in this case we believe function as international law, such as the Moon Treaty, because of the egregious violations of international environmental standards. Now, let's get to the question of whether there is any evidence that there may be extraterrestrial civilizations on the moon,
yes,
and that this may be viewed as an act of aggression, or that there may be secret bases that now other nations such as China, Russia, Japan, and the European Space Agency are seeking to go to the moon, that the U.S. would want to eliminate traces of secret bases that either it itself has on the moon, or that extraterrestrials may have had in the past with the bombing. And
yes,
there's not only a planned bombing on October 9th, but there's a follow-on bombing of the same sort planned under the L-Cross mission.
Is that Alfred? Sorry to cut you off there, but is that in another region, or are we still in the South Pole region of the moon for the second bombing?
I'm not totally sure. I know that if you go to the NASA website on L-Cross, and if you go to the various articles, they talk about a second L-Cross bombing planned.
Okay.
Now, let's look at some of the evidence that there may be extraterrestrial bases, an extraterrestrial presence on the moon. First of all, we have the testimony of Air Force Sergeant Carl Wolf, who was a Disclosure Project witness in the 2001 press conference. And what he says is that in 1965, he was in a secret National Security Agency, NSA, facility, and that there he was shown detailed pictures and documents setting out an extraterrestrial base on the far side of the moon that NSA had discovered and photographed and documented thoroughly. Secondly, if we look at the Apollo 11 mission with Buzz Aldrin and others, there is, first of all, we have the statements of Buzz Aldrin in a television documentary, Apollo 11, The Untold Story, in which he himself states that when the Apollo 11 module landed in the moon, there were two very large and very aggressive, apparently extraterrestrial spacecraft at the edge of the crater in which the Apollo 11 module was landing.
Yes.
And that then we have